Well, good morning, and can I welcome everybody to this, the 21st meeting of the Public Audit Committee in 2025. Agenda item 1 is for the committee to decide this morning whether or not to take agenda items 3, 4 and 5 in private. Are we all agreed? We are agreed. Thank you very much. And the second item on our agenda is further consideration of the Auditor General for Scotland's report on the Scottish National Investment Bank. And so I'm very pleased to welcome our two witnesses this morning. We are joined by Al Denham, the Chief Executive of the Scottish National Investment Bank, and alongside him is Willie Watt, who chairs the Scottish National Investment Bank. We've got some questions to put to you based on the Audit Scotland report. But before we get to our questions, Mr. Watt, could I invite you to give us a short opening statement?
Thank you, and good morning to everyone in the room. We're very pleased to be here this morning to discuss the Auditor General's report. We were founded in November 2020. We're still a young organisation that's learning and developing, and we view an opportunity like this as a dialogue to help us in the way that we think about what we do going forward. We've made significant progress, I think, since our foundation in terms of developing processes, operations, governance, and we've built a portfolio of 43 investments with a committed capital of £780 million during that 4-year plus period. I think it's really worth remembering that the bank was set up to be an alternative to government giving grants. And grants once made are never recovered, but a commercial first plus impact investment delivers much more for the public capital than a one-off grant. And that's something we can develop further if the committee would be interested in that. And it's a fundamental premise of the bank's foundation. Our role as an investor, our place in the market are still developing. And I wouldn't say that we believe that we are the finished article yet, but we are clearly much further down the road towards that than we were at foundation. The Auditor General's report recognised the robustness of the progress we've made against missions and in terms of the governance of the bank. It also highlighted the need for the bank to have financial flexibility to fully develop into the effective development bank for the people of Scotland that it could be. And we look forward in particular to discussing the issues and challenges around that. And I would just like to say that the board of the bank is entirely in agreement with the Auditor General's views with regard to that particular issue.
Okay, thank you. I mean, just on that final point, could I ask you for the record if the bank accepts all of the findings and is prepared to follow up all of those recommendations which are targeted at the bank?
Yes. The key recommendation that relates to ourselves is a request for more transparency on decision making. Yeah. And, you know, we're moving in that direction and we're happy to move further with regard to that. And I think it would be helpful for stakeholders of all kinds, frankly, if we did more of that. So, yes, we accept that. With regard to the perpetual capital, which is how we describe the flexibility issue, the Scottish Government, we know, is attending the committee in September, and no doubt you will be able to ask them for their views on this. But we would underscore the importance of that financial flexibility. And as the Auditor General points out, it's been a live issue since foundation. When the Bank Act went through, I think there was an expectation by many people that actually it would be a perpetual institution. It then hit up against public sector accounting rules. And we've been trying to unravel that conflict ever since. Action is required by both the Scottish Government and the UK Government to do that. Some progress has been made, and the Scottish Government has given us limited flexibility with our year-end capital of 25 million in both directions. And the UK Government has published a couple of reports around public finance organisations like ourselves and the National Wealth Fund, the British Business Bank, which give us a route towards that perpetual status.
Thank you. And I think during the course of this morning we will probe into those areas a little bit more, because I think you're right. The environment which you operate in is one of the issues highlighted in the Audit Scotland report, and is certainly something members of this committee want to ask the two of you about. Yeah. I'm going to invite Graham Simpson to open up with this morning's questioning. Graham.
Thanks, Convener. Good morning, gents. Mr. Watt, can I just follow up on what you've just said about the UK government giving you a route towards that perpetual status? Yeah. Can you say a bit more about that? What have they actually done? Yeah,
well, what they've in October of last year, they published what has become known as the Puffin Report, P-U-F-I-N, which is about how primarily the National Wealth Fund can become a perpetual institution. As I said in my introductory remarks, the problem with financial flexibility is to do with UK Treasury rules. So it actually impacts other development banks as well as ourselves. And we view that report, and there's been one or two successor reports, as really important. It sets out the definition of what a financial institution should be to have that perpetual status, and we tick all the boxes of it. Being open, I'm not sure when it was written that the Scottish National Investment Bank was at the forefront of the UK government's mind, but the fact that it was a principle-based report is helpful because we meet the principles. We're discussing with the Treasury how we can become part of that route forward, and the Scottish Government is also having parallel discussions with Treasury and Treasury ministers with regard how that can come about. And that we'll talk about what the problems are with our current status, but it could potentially be a really positive route forward to dealing with them.
So what would need to happen then? Would there need to be legislation, do you think? There would, at a UK level?
Well, the UK development banks would require UK legislation, but it would probably also require Scottish Government legislation as well.
Okay.
And the complexity is that our funding comes through the devolved settlement, rather than direct from the Treasury. So that there's an additional layer of financial rules that would require to be amended.
Well, I was going to ask about that because most of your funding has been from financial transactions so far, and they've got to be repaid to the Treasury. Does that cause issues?
Not from an operational standpoint, because the responsibility for repaying financial transactions sits with the Scottish Government. And the Scottish Government and the UK Government look at financial transactions as a kind of unified pot. So there is no pressure on us to return capital to the Scottish Government and then onward to the UK Government.
So the responsibility is the Scottish Government rather than yours?
Correct.
So you don't have to worry about it?
Correct.
Okay.
There's a lot of things we've got to worry about, but that's not one of them.
That's not one of them. Right. Well, that's useful. Because I was just wondering whether that affects, and it probably doesn't now, you've said that, your targeted rate of return.
No, it doesn't. The targeted rate of return is really all about investment input factors.
Okay. and your targeted rate of return is 3 to 4%. And I genuinely want you to help me out here, because I don't know the answer. But when I looked at that, I thought, well, that doesn't sound particularly high. I, as an individual, could probably get more than that. Just by going to a bank or some financial institution. I could probably get better than 4%.
You would get better than 4% because you'd put it in a long-term deposit account where it would be in cash, effectively. We can't do that as a development bank, and you wouldn't expect us to. So how we think about our target rate of return is essentially what we're looking for here is a commercial positive return, so it's not like a grant, as I was saying in my introduction. We're looking for those returns to be at a level that could potentially crowd in private sector capital, so they can't be ridiculously low either. But we're also a development bank that's been specifically tasked with taking more risk than the private sector. So when you add all that together, what you get is, and the final point I should make is that we do a lot of different things, from investing in funds which are low risk, low return, investing in debt, which is a little bit higher risk but modest return, and investing in equity, which is very high risk but potentially very high return. So if you look at us, we're more like the balance sheet of an asset-owning entity, like a pension fund, than we would be like as a fund, because we don't do one thing. We do about 4 or 5 things. So we bottom-up model what we think the returns should be for each of those buckets. But what we then do is we then hit a much higher loss rate against that. And that's what brings the target rate of return down to 3 or 4%. So we then benchmark that against other development banks around the world, and they are, broadly speaking, all around that kind of level. And I'm looking at my notes here because I wrote down the UK Infrastructure Bank, which was the precursor to the National Wealth Fund, has a 2.5 to 4% return target. The British Business Bank has a 1.2 to 3.2% target rate of return. So these returns are really about the combination of financial return and being a development bank. And what we're trying to do here is make sure that there is a positive return to the public purse, but also do all the other stuff as well. Hopefully that's helpful.
Yeah, that's very helpful. I mean, these other banks that you've mentioned, these other development banks, which have been around for longer, what do they actually achieve rather than their target rate of return?
Yeah, it's a good, interesting question, actually. I mean, it depends, because they all have sort of different sort of remits. One of the most interesting is maybe KfW, which is the German development bank, and it has it's been around for about 40 years. It's a very, very powerful institution that intervenes in the German economy in lots of different ways to, if you like, try and precipitate growth and development. So, for example, it does a lot in public housing as a housing bank. The Green Bank of Connecticut, which in its name would suggest what it does, is much more about net zero projects in the state of Connecticut in the US. What I think mature investment banks also illustrate is that they raise money from lots of different sources. They usually borrow on their own balance sheets. So our ambition is to become much more free of public sector financing. We don't have any ambition to not be in the public sector, but we want to be free of public sector financing. And if you look at those organisations, they very much more are than we are.
And those organisations that you've mentioned, though, the KFW and the Green Bank of Connecticut, do you know what they're achieving?
Oh, in terms of returns?
Yes.
I mean, I don't want to quote numbers off the top of my head, but they're broadly speaking in the kind of range that we're talking about here.
Okay.
Sort of lower single digits. Oh, sorry, I misread your question.
No, that's okay. That's really useful. Now, you'll invest in a company, whatever stage they're at. I mean, for example, you've got, I think I'm right in saying £10 million in the fast-growing property app firm Utopia.
Yeah.
And you own some shares in that. How do you actually anticipate getting a return on your investment in companies? There's probably different ways, but if you could just tell us.
So that's an equity investment that we've got, and you're right, we've got £10 million in that one, or give or take a few, to rounding errors. That's actually, Utopia has actually been awarded a number of good accolades over the recent year. Deloitte fastest 50 growth companies, gets noted in a number of awards, and is a real success story for Scotland. We came in and provided them with equity. As they go on their journey, they will be seeking further equity as they look to other institutional investors over time. And what we will do over time, we will exit in due course. Now, that's not currently going to be in the near term because we can ride that growth, we can ride the growth and value of that investment, and it might well be that, I don't know what the time frame is, but it's not in the short number of years, it'll be medium-term number of years. We're a development bank, long-term investment. Patient capital. So at some point we will exit and we'll recycle that money back into other opportunities. And that's why, using that example, which was a great, thank you for that question, we can take the success of a company like that, take the proceeds and put it back into another company at some point in the future and create that perpetual fund. So that's a good example of what perpetual fund actually means as well. So but that's how we would get our value. Right. And in the meantime, as it grows in value, as one would assume that it will because of its business performance, we will take that through our valuation process and reflect that into our target rate of return and our actual returns on the value of our portfolio at that point in time when it's revalued.
So in that case, and you're right, they do appear to be doing very well, and they've won some plaudits. So at some point, you will have a look at what your shares are worth, and if they've gone up by a certain amount, you'll cash them in.
Effectively, and that's pretty normal for private asset investors. We're not doing anything different to anyone else.
What we'll do is we'll work with management, and we'll work with them on what their plans are. As Al said, what happens with software companies is there comes a point at which they'll be either they list on the stock market or they're bought by a bigger software company. And we have, unusually, covenants in our investment agreements that tie the companies that might buy Utopia to Scotland. Because obviously we're a development bank, we want the returns, but we also want the jobs. And we want the intellectual capital to reside in Scotland. So we have covenants around head office, those kind of things. But what we're trying to do with a company like Utopia is it comes under our innovation mission. We don't think Scotland has enough well-paid jobs. We don't think it has enough growth. We don't think it has enough businesses of the future. And what we want to do is replicate a kind of Skyscanner effect where you create a unicorn-type business which employs a lot of people in Scotland. When it's sold, a lot of people, including quite junior people, actually make some money. That gets recycled in the economy. And then people that worked in that actually go out and found other businesses. And it's that sort of virtuous circle that we're trying to kind of stoke the engine of.
What you don't want, and we do see this quite a lot in some sectors, is, you know, a company like that does really well, then gets bought over, and it moves somewhere else.
Yeah, that's what we don't want.
You see it quite a lot in the life sciences sector, actually.
Yeah.
And we don't want that. So just how do you prevent that? Well,
partly in the way that I alluded to, in terms of putting things into the agreement, the investment agreement that we have with the company that they have to sign up to. Partly by doing that, I think partly by taking a patient view and not forcing them to exit. And what I often say to Al and the team is that we should be taking a longer-term view of these things than a conventional private sector investor would, because we're a development bank and because of exactly the point that you make.
Yeah. Yes, Mr. Den.
Can I come in on that point as well? And you actually make there's another angle to your question about, you know, founders going and you come up with a great idea, then the funding comes from some other part of the world, and they're as part of their funding agreement with whoever it may be, that they say, well, we'll fund you if, for example, life sciences, if you move to, for example, Boston. So that's one of the roles of the Scottish National Investment Bank, is to provide local funding to those businesses to try to ensure that they stay in Scotland. So that was one of the premises of actually setting up the bank in the first place. Okay.
Right, I'm going to move on to the one disaster that you've had, and you've been asked about this before, and I've asked you about it before, Mr. Watt, but that Circularity Scotland, which was a disaster, there's no other word for it. What lessons have you learned from that?
Do you want to take that one?
I'll take that one. So I was asked about this probably a few months into my tenure, and it was quite useful to go back and have a look at lessons learned. So I looked at it through the lens of Chief Investment Officer, CEO lens, and I looked back through the audit trail of how my colleagues approached that transaction or that investment through the course of the journey there. So obviously the process was a multi-stage process, as any investment process is, and with my experience as a professional investor in this business for a long time, I looked back through that process and thought it was a robust process. You know, the actual elements of the due diligence that were done would be what I would expect if I was working for another well-known asset manager, and I've worked for a number of them, and so I recognised what I saw. As we went through that process, we obviously took into account some of the macro factors that were relevant to this business. As you do, you look at micro factors and macro factors. And in the micro factors, we noted that deposit return schemes were something that were prevalent globally. They were also part of the policy framework and direction of travel for UK government, Scottish government and Welsh government. So we took that as what we called at the time, and if I go back through our papers, as a risk mitigant. What we didn't expect was that there might be a reading of the Internal Market Act, which actually said that there was a difference of view of that act between certain of those players. So in the spring of 2023, UK government said we're happy to do this, but not until 2025, and that was when the investment started to unravel, and the administrators were called in at that point. So I think the thesis that deposit return schemes would happen was a sound basis. I think the actual implementation of that between different parts of the UK government ecosystem was something we had not, in 2020 hindsight, anticipated. Yeah. And I think that's what led ultimately to the decision taken to delay that, and ultimately to the business falling. Willie, you wanted to?
Yeah, I think we underestimated the politicisation of the deposit return scheme between the UK government and the Scottish government. And I think the company itself, with hindsight, made a mistake, which was that they focused on getting the commitment of all the big producers of plastic and all the big retailers of plastic, all of whom had signed up to the scheme. But what they didn't do was they didn't carry the small producers and the small retailers. And the small producers and the small retailers didn't like the scheme, as you'll all remember as MSPs. I'm sure you had letters from them. And so what actually happened was that the commitment towards the scheme started to drift away. And you know, I agree with what Al said. With hindsight, we didn't. Our judgment on the risk that could happen was wrong.
Okay, well that's very honest. And perhaps one of the lessons should be that because you see yourselves as independent from government, that actually you should be very wary of investing in things which are government schemes, because they can become political, as that did. Is that something you've reflected on?
I think you make a good point. I think the counterpoint is that if you walk around Europe on holiday, you'll see deposit return schemes in most major European countries. And you know, from the point of view of our net zero mission, it was a really central. We thought it was a really good thing that the country should do, and that was where our, if you like, big picture enthusiasm came from. But I think I think there is something in what you say.
Thank you. That's useful. I will move on then. My final question is about the turnover of chief execs. And you, Mr. Denham, you're hoping to retire at some point. We're recruiting for somebody else. I think you're the third chief exec, and there was an interim. That's quite a turnover in a short period. Is that something that maybe, Mr. Watt, is that something that concerns you?
I think our first chief executive was 2 years in the role. Sarah, who acted as an interim, did the job for a few months, and Al will have been with us for 2.5+ years before he retires. I'm not concerned about that. I think the ability of the bank to drive forward through that, bearing in mind that our first chief executive joined a year before the bank was launched. So we're talking about a 5.5–6 year period since the first CEO was appointed. I think we have demonstrated significant forward momentum within the organisation. And the individual decisions that were made around those people, I was highly supportive of. So I'm as you would probably expect me to say, I'm not concerned about that.
Okay. I mean, it took a while. I think I'm right in saying it took a while to recruit you, Mr. Denham. Have you had a good level of interest in this job now?
Yes, we have, and I've just come out of a meeting with our search consultants, and we have international interest in the job as well. But it's a difficult job to do. It's not an easy job. There are some people that don't like things like this, for example. They find them quite difficult. There are challenges around remuneration. There are challenges around this public-private place that we sit in the middle of. But on the other hand, there's huge enthusiasm for the missions. There's real enthusiasm for making a difference in Scotland, both for people who are Scots or returning Scots, but actually also people who just really are excited by what a development bank can do in a country of this size. Because it's as we all know, it's a small country, and there are advantages to that as well as disadvantages. So I'm very confident we'll be able to hire the right person, but we're also, as a board, very aware of the challenges in hiring the right person.
Okay, thank you, convener.
Okay, thank you very much. Before I bring Stuart McMillan in, I think Jamie Green wants to ask a question on the Circularity Scotland issue.
Thank you, convener. Good morning, gentlemen. I'll be asking some questions later in the session, but before we did move on, just for the purpose of the flow of it, so you've just been asked about lessons learned from Circularity Scotland, and I listened with intrigue to your responses. What I heard in response was a summation of what went wrong with the deposit return scheme, what went wrong with Circularity Scotland. We already know what went wrong with that. What I didn't hear was what went wrong in your internal decision-making risk assessment processes. Now, Mr Denham, you said that you are confident that robust processes were followed in that decision-making toward the initial investment. And then, Mr Watt, you seemed to suggest that you were somewhat surprised by the politicisation of the issue. The issue had been highly political since it was first mooted by the government, and anyone worth their weight in research would have been able to tell you that. So what I'm still struggling to understand is who within your organisation made a decision that this risk was low enough. In what way was this never going to become a political issue? And the reason I ask it is because I'm particularly nervous that 50% of your investments are in the net zero space at the moment. And of course, we all know that there's a shifting sands around these issues.
Well, I don't accept your premise that we didn't go through our processes properly. The issue with investments is that you always look like an idiot if the investment goes wrong, by definition, because you have the benefit of full hindsight. So I think Al was articulate in terms of his review of the processes that we went. I was on the investment committee that made the decision. So, I'm happy to own the decision that we made on Circularity Scotland. We clearly discussed the political risks. So it's not like we didn't think there were any political risks. We did think there were political risks, but we underestimated the politicisation of it. And whilst it was political because it was introduced by the government of the day, it had support across the whole of the UK, which had a different political party in Westminster at the time, and it was the settled policy of both Scotland and the UK. So it became significantly more politicised as it unfolded, and I thought I was making an insightful comment about the fact that politicisation was to do with the fact that the company was not particularly successful in carrying all stakeholders with it, particularly the small producers, the small independent distilleries and small independent brewers, and also the small independent retailers like tobacconists and newsagents. And so I think what that did was increase the politicisation significantly in Scotland, and then there was a disagreement to do with the interpretation of the Single Market Act about whether Scotland could do glass and plastic versus only glass in the UK. And that
wouldn't you have unearthed these issues before committing £9 million of public money to it?
Well, we couldn't unearth the issues around the politicisation of the small stakeholders because we weren't aware of that. And we did look at the Single Market Act, but we didn't think, we thought there was a way through that, and that was the commonly held view of most people at that time. Things change. We will make losses in this bank. The thing that surprised me is how little we've lost in the 4.5, 5 years that we've been in business. Not how much we've lost. I deeply regret the loss of the Deposit Return Scheme, Circularity Scotland Capital. We're not complacent about what we've learned about it. I was honest with Mr Simpson with regard to his challenge about investing where things are political. We got it wrong. We made a mistake. We own the mistake. We try and move on.
Fair enough. Thank you. Thank you.
OK, thank you. Bringing back lots of memories for me about meetings with the Scottish Grocers Federation and visiting glass manufacturers in Ayrshire and so on, but that was some time ago. I'm going to invite Stuart McMillan to put some questions to you about the broader environment that you operate in. Stuart.
Thank you, Convener. Just on the memories, that, when you mentioned about Europe, took me back to 1984 when I studied in Germany, where the Deposit Return Scheme that was in operation there was... Absolutely. So, I mean, I grew up in Port Glasgow, and obviously recycling wasn't apart from some juice bottles, it wasn't really much of a thing here, as you know. So, come back to the agenda. So, obviously, the bank operates with the single-year funding allocations from the Scottish Government, and also there will be some challenges with this. I know you've touched upon some comments earlier on with, in this area. So I'm keen just to try to get a bit more of an understanding as to how you actually manage to deal with this, how you align it with the commercial activity, including the preparedness for, and also the ability to actually manage the investment losses.
Yeah. It's a big challenge. So the way that the bank operates is it gets an allocation from the Scottish Government on an annual basis, and we can't go above that allocation because there wouldn't be any available capital to finance it. So what happens is we structurally have to undershoot every single year. So when we're going into that final quarter, we're looking at investments that we can make. You know, the pipeline is something that Al will manage. We'll look at how long it takes for individual investments to go through the legal processes and the diligence processes, which can vary and can shoot out or pull back. And we then have to try and make a decision as to whether to what level we can commit finance. The challenge we've got is that we will do diligence and then we will decide not to do something. So we had an instance in the financial year that's just ended where we were really excited about a company and we were going to commit 30 million of capital to it, and we then found out things about it that completely changed our view. And so that was 30 million that was slated to complete in the year, which we then had to pull out. It was too close to the end of the year to invest it in anything else, and so we didn't meet our deployment target. So we've the challenge here is that most public bodies operate under this annual funding regime, so it's not in any way unique to the bank. So what we've been discussing with the Deputy First Minister and with her Exchequer colleagues is some degree of flexibility at the year end that would allow us to better manage our capital. And what we've been granted is 25 million of flexibility in terms of being able to over or undershoot our budget in any one year. Now, that's helpful on a practical basis, but it doesn't go as far as we would like.
So that flexibility, so is that already in operation?
Yes.
When did that come in?
Well, it came in at the end of the last financial year, so very recently.
Okay. Okay. So with that, then, I mean, I'm not looking for names of companies, but were there any particular? You gave one example here. Any other examples where, because of the lack of flexibility beforehand, that it's had a bit of an impact on what you do?
Well, I think the other areas where it's a problem is where the diligence takes longer than everyone thinks, and or the putting together of the other funding around the project takes longer, which is quite common. And so then it runs over into the next year, and we're kind of eating up next year's budget from something that potentially we could have invested in this year. And of course, the bigger the projects are, and we can invest up to 50 million, the bigger the projects are, the more of a challenge. The more of a challenge that could be.
Okay. Did you want to come in, Mr. Devon?
What I would say is this is peculiar to an entity working in the public sector or an investor acting in the public sector. I've worked in the private sector for the last 37 years of my career. This was never an issue. The due diligence took how long the due diligence took. The pulling together of the group of investors took however long it took. And if it fell over, if it took another 2 months, it took another 2 months. So it's a unique challenge that we face. And as Willie said, on the other side of the coin, we can't overspend. So you're trying to thread a needle to some extent on this. But at the end of the day, I think you should be assured that we will not deploy for the sake of deploying. We will make the right decision, and that decision that Willie referred to was the right investment decision not to deploy. And I think I would like to think that you would take comfort from that decision. Having the flexibility will help in this regard, because if you're doing a deal or an investment, that sort of deals a bit terminology. If you're doing an investment, you want to make sure that you do the right investment and do the right due diligence. And sometimes that just takes longer. Sometimes it can be quicker. Having the perpetual status will also help us in that regard as well. But this is unusual for an investor to have that type of constraint.
No, that's helpful, thank you. So, Mr. Watt, earlier on you referenced two banks, the KFW and the Green Bank of Connecticut. So KFW is a state-owned bank. I was just checking that a few months ago. Now, obviously, every country's got their own set of financial rules. But in terms of Germany, do they operate under between the federal government and also the lender government? Do they operate under something similar with regards to the year end?
I don't know. Is the short answer. I don't know.
So just the purpose of that question is obviously they've been around, as you indicated, about 40 years, and yourselves obviously it's a lot shorter. But that drive that you want to, and the direction of travel that you want to take SNIB into, would it be more akin to likes of the KFW?
I mean, listen, we're a long way short of what the KFW has achieved, but that would be an aspiration to be as powerful an institution as that if you take a long-term view. I think the problem with budgets is an issue that other development banks around the world have, because governments tend to think in annual cycles. And that's why, of course, the other development banks in the UK, like the National Wealth Fund, have the same problems that we've got. And, of course, the Treasury is now trying to think through that, because I suppose there's more of a political consensus around the fact that development banks are actually a good thing. You know, I think the previous Conservative government founded the UK Infrastructure Bank. We were founded by an SNP government. Labour has beefed up the UK Infrastructure Bank to the National Wealth Fund. So I think there's a political consensus around the role that development banks can play in the UK. But what nobody's properly thought through is how you change public sector accounting rules to actually allow development banks to do what they are set up to do. And we're playing a bit of catch up. And, you know, we've been around for 4.5 years. And, you know, it's been one of the key things on my agenda since I came here, and we haven't solved it yet. So, you know, if you want to criticise me for something, then they criticise me for that. But I think there is now, as I was saying in my introductory comments, I think there's a window of opportunity now to really do something here and make it work.
I mean, that's very helpful because, I mean, so with what you've already indicated this morning, I mean, you genuinely appear to want to get the bank into this kind of perpetual investment fund operation. But what's clear is the funding rules are getting in the way and stifling some of that.
I think what it would do is the other elements of it that we haven't talked about, which I think are important, are that at the moment we have to give back return capital flow to the Scottish Government. Now, if we could keep that in the bank, we could then reinvest it. If we talked about Utopia earlier on, and if Utopia is a great success, and it's a big if, and we could be talking in 10 years' time, but if Utopia was an incredibly large success, what we would want to do is take the profits that the Scottish National Investment Bank has made and then reinvest that in 10 other Utopias. And at the moment, we can't do that. And then the other issue, which the committee, I think, will be concerned about, is that if we have a loss, and we will have more losses, I can assure you of that, if we have more losses, there's nowhere to write those losses against apart from the central government account. So, but if we were a perpetual institution, we would write those losses against our own balance sheet. And, you know, if we'd made a big profit in Utopia but had lost a lot of money in the deposit return scheme, then it would be netted off against each other. But we don't have that ability to net off. So I think perpetual status would be good for the bank, but it would also be good for in terms of the public governance, because it would stop these surprises, from hitting the government's own accounts.
So, in terms of the current situation that you face and you operate under, also there's been a bit of movement with regards to the 25 million, which is positive. Are there any other elements where there has been additional flexibility provided to the bank?
No.
Right. So, if there are no further changes with regards to that flexibility, how do you see that affecting the bank, say over the course of the next 5 years and 10 years?
We'll still make investments. Hopefully the net of those investments will be positive, but we won't be able to grow and become more influential, and we'll still be totally reliant on government funding. And the bank's vision is ultimately to be completely self-funding, so that we'll still be the government's development bank, but the government won't have to put any of its annual budget in at all. It'll all come from our own resources. And once the bank becomes self-funding, it could then borrow on its own balance sheet. And one of the things that the KFW does is it gears its own balance sheet significantly, which gives you even more capital to. So the whole thing can become a self-perpetuating positive if we can nail this. Otherwise, we will just continue to operate as we have been doing.
And that will be the same, obviously, across the UK in terms of.
It will, yeah, it will. And what we're keen to. When I speak to UK government ministers, I'm keen to emphasise the importance of treating the Scottish National Investment Bank in the same way as the National Wealth Fund. And we want to be treated in a similar way, because we think that our missions align with government policy, whether that's UK government policy or Scottish government policy.
And that also wouldn't reduce the level of governance and oversight that governments and also public audit committees would actually have upon SNIB.
Yeah, yeah, it wouldn't change our oversight or our ownership at all. We'd still be completely accountable to government. I guess that accountability would probably rise because the more important the organisation became, then the more important the accountability would be.
Okay, well, that's helpful. Thank you very much. Thank you, Convener.
Thank you. Before I bring in Colin Beattie, can I take you back on this theme to an answer you gave to Graham Simpson some time ago, which is that you said that in order to change that regime that you work under, that public sector regime, it requires legislation.
Yeah.
Doesn't it just require a change in the Treasury rules? In other words, have you carried out any research that leads you to the conclusion that it requires a change in the law, or is it just a matter of reforming the way the Treasury works?
I think it's a bit of both, to be honest.
Okay.
There is undoubtedly an element of changing rules, and you know they're there for a good reason.
Arguably, Mr. Watt.
Yeah,
the Treasury is not always right. I've
no,
found.
No, I'm sure that's right, but you can understand why they want to try and control how much is borrowed. But I may be wrong here, and if I am, I apologise to the committee. But I feel that there is a requirement for a change in legislation, but I can't quite put my finger on why I think that. So apologies for being uncertain about that answer.
No, that's fine. And if you've got an opportunity to put something in writing to us that maybe reflects any research you've done in that area, that would be helpful to the committee.
We'll definitely do that.
Yeah, because it might be easier to change the law than it is to change the minds of the Treasury. But anyway, Mr. Beattie.
Thank you, Convener. I'd like to look at areas of our governance, operational arrangements and independence. And I have to say from the outset I was pleased to see that the bank's established sound governance and reporting arrangements, and that the bank's got a clear decision-making framework in place. It's really important. One area which I would like to ask you about within that is it does say that from the outset the bank developed governance arrangements which met its public sector requirements while also being aligned with the private investment finance sector. How difficult was that, and how effective has that been?
I'll ask Al to...
Yeah, thank you. I'll take that one. So, again, to give context, I've been in the financial services sector for a long time, and also being on senior leadership teams within the financial services sector through that period. So I've seen what the governance looks like. One of the things that I can say is that the governance that's been set up within the Scottish National Investment Bank is similar and what I'll call recognisable to me as someone coming in. So you've got your board, your audit committee, your REMCO, your investment committees, etc., finance, everything that you would expect. So good internal governance, internal auditors, external auditors, checking and making sure that we're operating to the right standards. You've got a board which is setting strategy and holding the executive to account, and an executive team that is executing the strategy. So we have been designed as in that sort of private sector, PLC sector model. And I think that's operating well, and I think that's been recognised in the approach. But we are not private sector. We are owned by the shareholder, and so we also have additional oversight, which is absolutely right and proper from the public sector. And what we have been set up to be doing is we're obviously held to account by the public sector, which is right, and by MSPs and by the Scottish taxpayer. But what I would stress is that the way it's been set up, and the Act was set up by design, was that we were operationally independent, and that comes to the point that we are making investment decisions for the right reasons rather than being led in a direction. So we're striking that balance, I think, quite well. I think what we've got is we have, on behalf of the Scottish taxpayer, there's what we call the shareholder team that acts as the conduit on a day-to-day, week-to-week basis for keeping an eye on us. But I think as the Auditor General's report says, it's sufficient, but it's not overreaching. I think I forget the exact words, and that strikes the right balance there. And I think we would agree with that. But clearly, the other area that's been set up is the Ministerial Advisory Group to advise the Deputy First Minister on the bank, but they do not have any governance role in us day to day, so they're not advising our board or double-checking us. So I think we've got a very robust framework, and I think it's recognisable. And I think as we go on the journey that we're going through with our FCA authorisations, etc., that framework is what a regulator would expect to see of an asset manager, which is what we really are. And so if we're going to be managing money on behalf of others in due course, which is our ambition, then we would need to be recognisable to a regulator who also regulates other investment institutions. So hopefully that's not too long-winded, but I thought it was useful to draw out the comparisons and the differences.
If I could maybe add, one of the things we did was to map across the governance requirements of a public body with the governance requirements of a company. And we did literally a kind of mapping exercise. And as you would expect, there's a lot of sensible overlap. But where there are differences, we made sure that those were carried forward into our governance framework. The other thing that we have is what's called a shareholder framework document, which basically is the contract between ourselves and the Scottish Government. And that contract allows, it specifies what is the responsibility of the bank and what's the responsibility of our shareholder. And that's a really helpful document because it kind of lays out, and it's a public document as well, so it's on our website. People can look at it and see what's in there. But you're right, it is a complex mapping exercise to make sure that we get the best of both worlds, not the worst of both worlds.
Do you get any feedback from the market on that? Is there any market view?
Do you want to take that?
I wouldn't say we've had feedback on that, but what I think is very useful is we're seen to be commercial by those who view us as a commercial investor, and we're seen to be doing the right thing, we feel, from the stakeholders within the public sector world who are tasked with having a view upon us. So it depends. We've got many different stakeholders, so the market consists of lots of people. I think what I do find very important as we're going on our journey towards managing assets on behalf of other people is that we're seen to be acting commercially at all times. And that so if we're going to be managing money for XYZ institution going forward, that we're seen to be acting independently and commercially. So I think that's important. And that is something that I think we've had no negative views on, but I think we get positive, affirmative views when we talk them through our processes and our governance structures.
I think when the bank was founded, there was a lot of scepticism about our operational independence. I wouldn't have agreed to become chair of the bank if I didn't think it would be operational independent. But you have to prove that, and it's a legitimate concern. I think there's a lot less of that now, but that was probably the biggest, if you like, you're just a government department, you'll just do what you're told, you won't really be independent. Can we trust an organisation like that? There's a lot less of that now, but that was probably the biggest challenge we had to face with regard to that public-private issue.
Let me ask you several questions in one. I'd like to explore the criteria on which you base your investment decisions, the lessons you've learned from activity to date, and the progress you've made in implementing changes to investment strategy and investment decision-making processes.
Do you want to kick off on that, Alan?
Absolutely, thanks. So I'll start, I've jotted down the three key questions there, the criteria, the investment lessons and the progress. So the criteria we look through is hopefully it comes as no surprise, is we're looking for a commercial return. Do we think the business opportunity that we're investing in is something that we can earn a good return on our capital in due course? Either as an equity investor, as a fund investor, or as a debt investor. And that criteria is what's the business outlook and opportunity, how do we think the business will perform within that to harness or harvest that opportunity. And that would be the exact same investment process that any investor would go through based on my experience. And we've got a full investment process that sits behind that. We assess every new opportunity through that, it's a bit more detailed than just 3 lines there, but we assess all investment opportunities through those lenses, through what we call a new business forum, and that's the first part of our investment process, filtering, if you like. We will then take that through much more detailed due diligence if that passes that first forum, and again, dig in deeper and deeper and deeper, really double-checking that we're getting the right that we have the right investment thesis and that the investment thesis stands up. At that point, we'll then do things like intellectual property due diligence, if relevant, management due diligence, market due diligence, etc., etc. So we're really digging in depth and really forming a deeper and deeper position, making sure we're happy with the financial model underpinning the business. As we've gone through this process, we will then finally make an investment decision, yes or no, to invest. And so that's the investment process. You then asked about investment lessons learned. We have been in position for 4.5 years. Today we started, it was new. We had a new team with new people working together. Processes had to be developed, etc. What we've done over that period is we've taken the learnings from that and we enhanced our processes last year to fine-tune some of those elements. So what we did was we actually tried to remove duplication in our process to speed it up, make it more efficient. We had some feedback from the market that we were a bit slow. We're now, that first phase is now a lot quicker, not weaker, but quicker. And then going through the rest of the process, we've also made sure that those processes we're doing the right things at the right time and remove duplication, making sure that we can do things efficiently. So what we've gone there is we've now improved what we think the mechanics of our investment process. We've also done things like lessons learned. We've thought about where did we need to learn from this. So we've thought about, in innovation, for example, we've moved our TRL rating, which is a shorthand for where a company is in the stage, from maybe a 3 to 5 level to an 8 level, to be a bit more certain that the commercial traction is there. So what we're doing is we're thinking a company is in its scale-up phase rather than it's still in the laboratory, if you like. And that's the difference. And we found that in our lessons learned that being in the scale-up phase was where we could actually add, I think, more value, or we think more value. Other things is making sure we get the right investment governance in place in the companies, making sure the board of directors are of the right calibre, etc., the right management team, etc., etc. So those are the kinds of investments learned. That we are, and I would like to think we will continue to be looking to improve and have investment learned mindset for the rest of our business. I've worked in businesses that are 200 years old where we still look to improve year in, year out. And I think I would like to think the bank will be doing that in the next 30, 40, 50 years as it becomes a perpetual fund to continue to improve and do things better. And I see it internally. And I think you have to put in the context of our age and our positive learning mindset to try to get better.
I realise it's still early years in terms of the life of the bank and that, there's going to be development going forward. You mentioned previously about asset management and so on, and you've expressed your ambition to broaden the activity that the bank's got into advice, investment arrangement activity, management of third-party capital. How does this all align with your core activities, the core purpose of the bank? also bearing in mind that these are fairly complex areas to get involved in, with new risks, new costs.
Yeah.
And the setup cost of this would be very substantial. I mean, the giving advice and managing people's capital, and you know, if you're actually going to be managing assets yourself, it's a huge jump.
Yeah, and it's one that both of us are very familiar with because it's the world from which we came. So we're very, very aware of what's required. And in terms of governance, the Financial Conduct Authority's levels of governance are very, very substantial, as you know from your own background. So we don't underestimate the degree of change that would be required. But what we've done, I think we've said publicly right from the start, is we've tried to run the bank as if it was a regulated entity from day one. We have tried to put in place, as far as we could, the systems and processes that we would be required. The reason for your point about alignment with our core purpose is so fundamental. And if any third-party capital that we managed was not aligned with our core purpose, then I would expect this committee to draw that out and be very critical of that, quite rightly. But with the development of impact investing as a commercial form of investment, there are now more organisations that with which we could invest that would have our shared values. Both, in all three of the key mission areas that we've got. We're not primarily interested in giving advice or acting as an advisor. But the permission that we got from the FCA was really one that protected the bank, because sometimes when we're putting investments together, we're trying to stitch together different investors, different companies, and we're, if you like, advising with a small a that you should do this and we could do that, and if we all move together, then this could happen. And we didn't want to stray into inadvertently giving advice, which would be illegal. So the permission that we've got at the moment allows us to have a regulated protection that we can give advice as long as we are within the FCA's rules. But it's not something that we see as being an independent part of what we do. We will always be an investor rather than an advisor. But sometimes in investing, there is advice. So the reason really that we're interested in third-party capital and that we're evaluating the risks that you quite rightly flag up is that we think that 200 million a year is insufficient to meet the bank's mission challenges. And, you know, it can act catalytically. We can make good investments. We can make bad investments. But our ability to move the dial would be much greater if we could manage third-party capital that was aligned against our missions. And it would also bring in more revenue to the bank, which would allow us to increase our staffing and resources at our disposal. So we accept your analysis of the risks. We are moving slowly in this area, deliberately, but it still remains very much our ambition.
Would you not be more or less compelled to separate out these different aspects of business into different companies, if you like?
Yes, I mean it may well be that the FCA permission that we have, as you'll know, is for one of our operating subsidiaries. It's not for the top company of the bank. So we would do third-party capital through a different subsidiary company, and we would require to separate out. But the fundamental premise would be side-by-side investment with what we're doing. So we wouldn't be, for example, raising third-party capital to go and do something that just happened to be really interesting commercially, but had nothing to do with what the Act tells us is our job, and to which we're fully committed. So what it would do would be, potentially, would be, if there was £2 required in an investment, £1 would come from the public purse and £1 would come from the private sector. But it would be the same investment with the same objectives, the same governance, and the same tenure in terms of time.
Would there not be a little bit of complexity there? Because you're going to have the parent company and 1, 2, 3, however many subsidiaries. If people are going to put money into the subsidiaries, would there not be some sort of requirement for a parent company guarantee for these subsidiaries? And if so, do you have the power to do that?
We don't think there would be any requirement for a parent company guarantee, but I mean, you're right, there would be complexity, but that complexity exists in the investment world anyway, because there are lots of investment entities that have different funds investing in the same. You know, it's there to be managed, and I don't underestimate the the technical issues around managing it. And you can get it wrong, and if you get it wrong, then that would be a bad thing to happen. But I think it's manageable. It's a manageable risk, in my opinion.
Presumably you're not going to be engaged on constructing new systems and so on. Presumably you'll contract with a third-party provider and make use of their capacity.
Absolutely. Sorry, Alan.
So I was just going to add, you made a point there that put money into subsidiary. The money from a third party wouldn't come into subsidiary. You'd think of our subsidiary managing a client's portfolio. It would be ring-fenced. It would be their money. And we're acting as a fund manager to that pool of money. So it's not commingled into the balance sheet in any way. And in that regard, you could think of our subsidiary, Scottish Investments Limited, as having the bank, Topco, as a client, and XYZ institution as another client, and providing the same service to different clients, and the monies are ring-fenced. You wouldn't commingle them in that way. I just want to make that clear.
No, I was assuming there would be a separation
Absolutely.
with all the companies required to do that. It's still a big undertaking, and getting the right people to be able to do that is going to be an expensive business.
I agree.
And while there's not a lot of capital needed to set up an asset management company, nevertheless, it won't be cost-free. Would you anticipate that coming out of profits?
Yes, I mean, we don't anticipate any public capital being required for additional staffing that might be associated with that. It's probably worth saying that for the last 2 years we've been operationally independent of the Scottish Government in terms of resource budget, and so we've had no Scottish Government resources to cover our operating costs, and we, touch wood, would perceive that would continue. And so if we were to make investments around third-party capital, those investments would come from surpluses that the bank had earned, rather than asking the Scottish Government to increase its commitment to the bank.
Okay, and perhaps one last question. You've emphasised the fact that you operate independently of the Scottish Government in pursuing the mission that you've got. Just for the record, you're absolutely satisfied that you have no interference from the government in this, that you have complete operational independence and freedom as far within the constraints of the missions, as far as your investments are concerned?
In terms of investment decision-making, there is no interference by Scottish ministers in our decision-making, and there is no interference in how we generate the investment strategy that goes hand in hand with the missions. The area in which the Scottish Government has most influence on the bank is in terms of public sector pay, where we are significantly constrained, some might say appropriately so, in our compensation arrangements. That, you know, in answer to your question, that's what comes to my mind as the major constraint that there is, but it's not in terms of investment decision-making or investment strategy or anything like that.
If I come back to what we were talking about in terms of future plans, if you have staff employed in subsidiaries, would they be also subject to the government constraints?
Yes.
They would be.
Yeah.
Okay. Thank you. Thank you, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much. And funnily enough, the Deputy Convener has also got some questions in this area as well as some others. So, Jamie, over to you.
Thank you, Convener, and thank you for calling for setting me up nicely there. I'll caveat my questions today by stating two things. One is obviously we're the Public Audit Committee, so we have a very specific role to scrutinise the numbers, and we don't make any apologies for that, but please don't take any of our questions personally. But also that the report overall from the Auditor General was perhaps on the more positive end of some of the reports that we see in this room. And I think that is to be commended and acknowledged at the beginning of the session. And I'm not just saying that because he made a substantial investment in XLCC in my home region, but that is also very welcome. But that won't influence the tenacity of my questions anyway. Let's start with your operating costs, gentlemen. So my understanding is that you've spent to date since 2020 around £41 billion in operating costs. I've got a little table that demonstrates your operating, how much money you're spending on running the business. Income, however, and I appreciate this is different from profit you'll make in future equity or future exit strategies. Income is 32 million, so that's about a £9 million difference. You could argue it's a loss, but I appreciate in the year 23-24 that reversed, that trend reversed. Is that normal in the first 5 years of a bank, first of all?
Yeah, thank you. I'll happily take that. So yes, as you can imagine, if you're building a new organisation, you have the start-up costs associated with that, and effectively the fixed cost element of that before you can get the income coming in. It's no different to us relative to any other company. And what we've been doing is we've been building our momentum, if you like, and building our portfolio. The income has been rising. So what you see is that there is now, as of last financial year, we're now covering our operating costs through the income in our portfolio. We'd expect that to continue to widen going forward. I wouldn't expect that to stay narrow, i.e. we'll control our costs and our income will rise, and you'll get a widening of that, of those jaws going forward. Certainly that's our plan. We do a 1+3 financial plan as part of our business plan. That goes through our board for authorisation, and that's the pattern we see going forward.
I think the difficulty that we had was that we had to set up all the people and processes but with no revenue because we had no investments. And so the first couple of years we relied very heavily on the Scottish Government's support, and I think most of those operational losses, we'll talk about capital losses I'm sure in a minute, but in terms of the operational losses, most of those were at the earlier period, and as Al said, we kind of hope, touch wood, that we won't be taking any more money from the resource budget.
Okay, I'm sure you studiously read the official report of the last session that we had in preparation for today's meeting, but one of the issues that did come up was the quite substantial difference in how much money the Scottish Government had allocated to the bank versus how much had been committed. And I appreciate, obviously, there not all investments will be made in the same financial year in which the deal, for example, is agreed. So I do understand there's a rollover element to that. But the numbers that I have in a letter from the Auditor General subsequent to that session, which I'm sure you've read also from the 16th of June, points towards around £70 million over the 5 years difference in how much money the government allocated to you versus how much you committed to investees. That's a substantial difference. Could you explain that?
Yes. Maybe I'll take that one.
Sure.
So there are a number of issues there. One is this issue that we talked about earlier on about always having to structurally undershoot. So if the allocation is 100, we cannot under any circumstance go above 100. So given that we're working on multiple investments with uncertainty of timing of completion, we're always going to undershoot by some degree. And obviously what we're trying to do is get it as close as we can. The second reason for undershoot is that we will get investments wrong, as we did with Circularity Scotland, in the future. But we're trying not to get investments wrong. So we will sometimes decide not to invest, and the cost of that is we miss our deployment target. But we perceive that to be the lesser of two evils, if you like. And the third issue is that sometimes something that you think will happen in one financial year gets delayed and it ends up happening in the next financial year. And these things kind of compound each other. And this 25 million that we talked about earlier on in terms of flexibility will help us with that problem that you highlight.
So if you had that ability to roll over, I'm going to call it underspend. I know it's not underspend, but it's that non-committed allocation. Effectively, you'd be sitting there with a fairly chunky pot of cash at the moment that you could invest had you been able to roll over. Is that correct?
Yeah, it would have made a difference, I think. The other thing I think I forgot to mention is that in the first couple of years, we had an allocation, but it was quite hard being a startup to have a pipeline. We had to build a pipeline. So some of that under allocation was to do with that. So there are a lot of different reasons for it, but you're right to highlight it as it is.
Okay. Now for some of the more icky questions, I'm afraid, and they may seem personal, but it's a matter of public record anyway. Mr. Denham, so you've resigned from your position. When did you do that? And are you serving your notice period at the moment, or what's the formalities around that?
Yeah, so the formality is I resigned, offered my letter of resignation at the beginning of April. I am working until a successor is found. The assumption is it will be the back end of this year sometime, and I will stay on as long as that takes. And I'm not going away, so I still do my job full time. I can tell you that for certainty. I'm not on gardening leave or anything like that, so I'm fully committed. And the point is actually of personal pride as well. I'm fully committed to making sure that this bank continues to fire on all cylinders and does a good job while I'm around, and do a good handover to my eventual successor.
Okay, it's very good to see you here today as a result. Is that when you handed your notice in, did you have to give 6 months' notice?
Well, my contract is 6 months, which is, it's an employment contract. But as I said, just in the last question, if it takes 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, to me it doesn't matter. Okay. I'm here until Willie finds someone. Now, if Willie finds someone after 6 months, great. If it takes, I'm speculating now. If it takes 8, 9, 10, whatever, fine. I don't mind.
Al's been really great in terms of giving me as much flexibility as I need. He could have just said, "Well, at the end of 6 months, I'm out of here," but we're just rolling it forward on a monthly sort of basis.
Yeah, that's good to know. You haven't booked your cruise just yet, then. Okay. Can I ask? And the reason I ask this question is because this is a very different scenario to the previous chief executive, who tendered resignation and exited very promptly from the organisation. and as we all know, and as is a matter of public record, was paid 6 months' salary in lieu. Yeah. What's the difference in the two scenarios here?
Well, I think that the most appropriate way to deal with Al's retirement was in a kind of long-term sort of gradual, not gradual, because as he says, Al's totally committed, but a handover type. But the personal circumstances and the company circumstances when our first chief executive resigned were different, and therefore we felt that that was the right way to deal with those circumstances then. And I still think that was the right way to deal with them.
Okay. I mean, you may have paid attention to the work of this committee on other public organisations and the departure of senior members of staff. We take quite a forensic interest in things like notice period and exit sums and remuneration. Yeah. And we're always keen to unearth those processes that were gone through, particularly from the chairs of organisations. That's well documented interest that we have. Anyway, I shan't reside on issues that are a number of years old now. We do talk about salaries, though, but I think this has come up quite a few times in the session this morning, is that there seems to me, and I felt this last time we talked about the bank, is an inherent conflict of interest between having to work under the restraints of public sector pay policies, which I think most people would agree do have certain caveats. For example, it's very unusual to have bonuses in public sector organisations. But you have quite a well-structured bonus system. Talk me through that.
Yes, it is unusual, but not unknown. And I think where it is more common is where the organisation has this kind of public-private interface, and then there are a number of other organisations in Scotland that have this, and indeed within the context of the UK. So the way that we look at it is that we think, the board believes that bonuses align the performance and behaviour of the individual staff member with the organisation's operational and strategic goals. And so that's why we have a bonus scheme. But equally, we recognise that it would be inappropriate to have a scheme that basically just paid out all in 1 year, particularly in a public sector environment. So our bonus schemes are structured as long-term incentive plans, and they pay out over 3 years, with 50% paid in the first year and then 25% in the following 2 years. And the reason for that is, again, to bind individuals to the organisation on a longer-term basis and make sure that their performance is, they see their performance as not just about, one and done, but something that is more sustainable. We also have clawback provisions within the schemes, whereby if in the investment industry it's called malus, and MALUS, and if there's any behavioural issues or any significant performance issues, we can claw back bonuses. So we have a kind of, we think, a robust set of rules around that, and that is policed by our remuneration committee. And our remuneration committee is entirely made up of non-executive directors, and they will look with a fine-tooth comb against the objectives that were set with regard to the bonus schemes and the performance of those schemes in any 1 year. And normally it's about 5 or 6 different key issues that build up towards the scheme. And the chair of that committee is a very, very experienced chief people officer who has worked in both the public and the private sector at a very high level, and she's all over all the detail in that. The final thing I would say is we have what's called a mission reward scheme, which is a bonus scheme that is aimed at all staff in the bank, and that is more about the alignment of of the achievement of our mission impacts with and allows every employee in the bank to share in the success of those impacts on an annual basis.
I mean, if I was being pessimistic, I would say it sounds to me like you're looking for reasons to pay bonuses that aren't based on financial performance, because the bank's only really just turned the financial corner this financial year.
Sure.
But you've been presumably paying bonuses for a number of years at quite a high level.
Yeah, I wouldn't. I think it would not be right to just pay bonuses based on financial performance, particularly in a startup situation where it's almost impossible to have financial performance. So the alignment of bonuses is based on as I was saying, a number of issues. Our investment deployment would be one. We'd look at impact performance. We'd look at governance as the third. We would look at people and culture. And we would look at stakeholder engagement. So those, I think, are the key, and financial performance. So we try and take all of those things into account, but it's all of those things rather than just focusing on financial performance.
And based on a previous answer you gave earlier in the session, and forgive me if I'm wrong, but I got the impression that you sounded like you want to be free from the shackles of public sector pay constraints to allow you to recruit perhaps more aggressively, to pay better terms and conditions, or to act as a quasi-commercial bank.
Yeah. Yes, I apologise if I gave that permission. I think, if I'm being honest, I think more freedom would be helpful, because ultimately what we're trying to do is recruit the very best people we can to make the very best investments we can on behalf of the people of Scotland. And we're not trying, there's no leakage here of profit out of the bank in any way. What we're trying to do is find the best people that we can employ and deploy those people towards our three missions. And I don't know if you saw it recently. There was quite an interesting report by the Hunter Foundation looking at public sector pay generally with regard to how different countries do it. And I think there is, it's not for me to say, but I'm going to say it anyway, I think there is a general issue around whether we are setting senior pay for senior civil servants, people that run public bodies, people that do really big and important jobs for the state, whether we have got that right generally with regard to whether we've got the balance between being frugal with taxpayers' capital, which is clearly important, and I can see why you're asking these questions, with have we got the right skill set to ensure that we're doing these jobs to the absolute best that they can be done. And I appreciate that it's a balance, and there's not a right or wrong answer. And I'm certainly not advocating massively changing the way that people are paid in the bank. That's not my point at all. But I guess my point is there's a balance in these things, and I guess we're all trying to get that balance right. Yeah,
I mean, people watching this might argue that £250,000 a year is quite a lot of money as a salary.
It is a lot of money. In any absolute terms, it's a lot of money. But what we need to do is invest our capital alongside private capital. We're investing large sums of money And you quite rightly gave us a hard time about the deposit return scheme in Circularity Scotland. If we don't have the very best people we can earn, you're going to be giving me more of a hard time about investments that go wrong. Now, and despite having the best people we can have, we still will make mistakes on investments. We'll still lose money, and I'm sure I'll be back at this committee in the future and you'll be asking me about losses that we've made, quite appropriately. But in the investment world in which we have to operate as a development bank, unless people have the right skill set, then we're taking a massive risk.
Yeah, and I do accept and acknowledge that. I'm not convinced entirely the argument that let us pay people more and we'll make fewer mistakes is the right argument, but I do see your point about attracting good talent. And it's also, the big difference here is if you wanted to be paid big bank salaries, go and work for a big bank. There's a burgeoning private sector out there you can go and work in. So
of course.
It's a very different environment.
Just on that point about making a mistake, I think it's more if we paid less, there would be more mistakes. It's my opinion.
Okay. I hope that's not the case, but
well, it would be.
I did have one final question. Before I moved on, can you confirm that all members of staff at the Scottish National Investment Bank are Scottish resident taxpayers?
Can I confirm? I don't think I can, no.
Okay. If you could perhaps write to us with that information, it would be helpful.
I'm not even sure I can write to you about it because it's really up to the Inland Revenue how it defines whether people are resident in Scotland or England, and I'm not sure we even have that information.
I'm sure you do.
But we will write to you on the subject, and we will try and clarify that.
Okay, it would just save me having to FOI, to be quite honest. Yeah. Thank you.
No, we're definitely right.
One final question is around an issue that came up in the last session around and it's going to lead into the next final set of questions around the balance of investments. Isn't it an area of interest to me, having spoken to a number of stakeholders who have engaged with the bank? It is stated in the Auditor General's report that 92% of investees are SMEs, which on the face of it sounds quite positive, but that's not the same as 92% of investments. Can you tell me the figures on that? How much money do you actually invest in small, medium-sized businesses?
Al, have you got?
I can take that one.
Thank you.
So you're correct. It's 92 or 93% of investees at the last annual report date, and I think it comes out to be 59 or 60% of pounds and pence at that same point. And the reason for that is some of those investments are bigger investments. For example, Artesier, etc. There's a big investment, and some of the smaller investments. So you get that tweaking.
Yeah, and I raised that because when I spoke to the Audit Scotland team who presented evidence to us on the report, it did come up as an issue in the consultations and feedback sessions that they'd been having with industry. And one of the comments made by one of the witnesses was, I will highlight some feedback from the financial services sector that the bank could sometimes take more risk to support scalable businesses, particularly in the tech sector, to improve Scotland's productivity. Is that something you would consider doing? Yes. Good.
Just on the point about SMEs, there are three criteria. One is turnover, one is a number of employees, and the third one is the capital invested in the business. And it's the capital invested in the business one that sometimes falls down. So if you look at something like Zero Avia, which is the hydrogen-powered aero engines, it's got less than 250 employees, it's got less than 40 million of revenue, but it's already had 150 million invested in it to get it to this stage. And XLCC in your own constituency would be another one where the scale of investment, it's still a very early stage company, but the scale of investment required is what kind of knocks it out. And that's one of the reasons why our stats are a bit different than you might expect.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Convener.
Okay, thank you very much. I've got a couple of final questions to put to you. And I want to begin by tidying up a couple of issues which have arisen in the previous round of questions. So, for example, if I go back to the questions put about remuneration arrangements, you mentioned that the Remuneration Committee had approved the long-term incentive plan and the mission contribution reward scheme and so on. But presumably that also gets ministerial sign-off.
Yes.
It does, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. Can I also then go to what sounded to me a bit like potentially mission creep?
Yes.
So when you were talking, I mean, my concept of the investment bank is that it's there to stimulate indigenous businesses, that it's there to, especially perhaps I'm a bit of a romantic, it's there to boost the manufacturing sector, for example, which I think is important to have a balanced economy. So can you, maybe go through with us this whole thing about the asset management? Sorry, not to repeat what the answers you gave to Colin Beattie, but when you spoke about that, it felt as though there could be a danger, maybe not under your tenure, Mr. Watt, or under Mr. Denham's, but the people that come after you might see themselves more as asset managers than innovative state interventionist generators of local jobs and promoting manufacturing and so on. How do you make sure that it doesn't transform itself as an institution into something which is a patient capital asset manager rather than something which is a kind of nimble, fleet-of-foot, innovative stimulator of economic development?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think one of the things that, firstly, we're governed by the Act, and the Act is actually it's actually a pretty good document. It's quite clear, it's quite short, and that I think gives some protection against the risk you mentioned, as does the shareholder framework document. But I think the key thing for me is the fact that we're an impact investor, and what that. And that was never, we were never asked to be an impact investor when we set the bank up, but we thought it was the best way to, if you like, deal with the challenge that you've just set us. And being an impact investor, what that means is that in every investment we look for social, environmental, payback as well as commercial payback, and that's hardwired into how every investment decision is made, and we're audited on that independently every couple of years through something called the Operating Principles for Impact Management, which is a United Nations standard approach to which is applied to both the public and the private sector impact investors. So we would always be an impact investor, and the capital that we would attract, maybe from the private sector, would also have to be impact capital. So we wouldn't accept capital from people that didn't share the same values that we share. And I think it's hardwired into the bank's board and its ethos. And over time, I suppose, we've just got to be careful that as management change and as boards change, that we don't allow that to be diluted.
Okay. I mean, you lead me inevitably to questions about the Gresham House Forestry Fund, which was for a while the biggest investment that the Scottish National Investment Bank had made up to your £50 million limit. And you may have heard me speak on this before, but the basis of the Gresham House Forestry Fund, when I looked at it when this investment was first announced, appeared to be less about saving the planet and planting trees than it was to help wealthy people avoid paying tax. How do you respond to that?
I respond by asking Al to answer your question.
So I'll go back to first principles, if you like, on what the Gresham House Forestry Fund actually is, and separate that from the, any other elements that you might be referred to. So the fund itself was set up to invest in new woodland and forestry in the UK, but it's actually now focused on creating new woodland, which is a long-term strategy that I think everyone believes is important to net zero. When it was set up, we were a cornerstone investor of 50 million into that fund. It's now pulled in a total of 300 million, it's 299 million or so, as of the last annual report, of institutional, including local government pension scheme money predominantly. The premise of the bank crowding in 50 to get 300 million of impact is an important one. That's why we went as a cornerstone investor. It's also important to note that 85% of that investment has gone into Scottish assets. So if the 50, I actually looked at their annual report, of the 59 woodlands and forests that they are invested in, most of which were new, so new woodland planting, are 49 of the 59 that are in the portfolio, 49 are in Scotland. So there's an immediate benefit to the Scottish economy and the Scottish forestry economy there. It's true that some investment frameworks that the government has authorised, such as ISAs and EIS schemes and so on, put in place some sort of incentivisation for certain individuals to invest in it. And I think Gresham is no different to any other investor in that regard. But there's, I would stress that there's the vast majority of the assets are institutional, including local government pension schemes.
Okay, but it was one of the eye-catching things about the investment, again, when it was announced, that we were told that 60% of its investment would be in Scotland. And the corollary of that, of course, is that 40% wouldn't be. So why is the Scottish National Investment Bank putting money into a fund which is not investing in Scotland?
Well, I repeat what I just said. They're actually up at 85% now of their assets. And if you have 85% of 300 million invested into Scotland, it's quite a big number. So that's where they're at based on their last annual report. And so they're actually beating that benchmark as they had in their guidelines at the time of investing. They're finding most of the opportunities are indeed in Scotland for them to make investments.
What we wrote into the agreement was that they had to invest more in Scotland than our 50 million. So there was always going to be more invested in Scotland than we'd invested. And that's something we do in all the fund investments that we do. We write in a condition that means that we get more investment in Scotland than our share, if you like.
Okay. Sorry, Mr. Daniel.
I'll just add one additional thing. One of the things that we've also made sure as part of our investment is that they act as a responsible investor in Scotland as well, in terms of local community support, in terms of public access, in terms of bringing communities with them and acting to the highest standards, highest regulatory standards in their area, and we hold them to account on that. Clearly, as an investor, we meet with all of the investees that we invest in. So it's not a case of here's a check, good luck. We meet with them on a regular basis. We'll make sure they're acting in the way that we think is appropriate. And as a senior investor in this, a major investor in this, we do make sure that they're looking after our money in an appropriate way.
Okay, but do you think it's appropriate, and maybe this is for you, Mr. Watt, I mean, is it appropriate that public money is being invested into a venture which involves a partner whose principal purpose is to show people ways in which they can avoid paying into the public purse, they can avoid paying inheritance tax, corporation tax, capital gains tax? I mean, is there not any ethical consideration around that kind of decision?
Well, the tax-based schemes in forestry are set up by the government as incentives to encourage more high net worth individuals to invest in forest assets. So they're set up as deliberately to give tax breaks for individuals to invest more in forestry, because at a policy level, somebody has decided that's a good idea. But this particular fund that we invested in wasn't primarily about that at all, which is why the main investors are pension funds, local authority funds. So the main investors in our fund are the local authority employees of 3 or 4 Midlands-based local authorities and the pension scheme of one of the UK's largest mutual banks. So Gresham does a whole bunch of different things, some of which are tax-based and some of which aren't, and this is not one of the tax-based. It's also regulated by the FCA, and if the FCA thought it was not operating to the highest standards, then its management team would be hauled over the coals.
Yeah, I'm not really questioning whether it's legal or not. What I'm questioning is the ethics of it. But let me move on, because the other thing which has happened, and this happened subsequent to your decision to invest in the Gresham House Forestry Fund, is that it's since been taken over by a New York-based private equity fund. And you mentioned earlier on about covenants that you take out with investees to make sure that they retain their headquarters here. So Gresham House was never headquartered here. It was previously headquartered in London, and now it's New York. But if I look at another investment, the Ardisia Port, which is another one of your maximum investments, that again, in turn, is owned by an organisation headquartered in Houston, Texas. Yeah. I mean, are these matters any consideration of yours at all? Yeah, they are. The Gresham situation is one in which the fund, as I was saying earlier on, is managed by Gresham, but the governance of is in the fund. So the new owners, whoever they may be, can not impact anything about that fund because it's governed by the fund governance, and we're on the fund management committee. And us and the other local authority pension schemes would certainly stop any drift in the policy of that fund. Ardisia is a different matter. Ardisia, we're massively encouraged by the fact that an infrastructure fund would want to put 300 million into the decarbonisation of power in Scotland. And the sums of money that are involved are so huge that we need to encourage inward investment by infrastructure funds. And actually, it helped us because they'd committed 300 million, so it made it easier for us in the National Wealth Fund to commit 50 million each, because there was already quite a big commitment there. Now, they are a commercial investor, but they see offshore floating wind in the North Sea as being a major investment opportunity. So I want to see more of those kind of investors coming in. Now, we have to do our diligence properly. We've got to make sure they're bona fide people, that their funds have come from the right places, that they've got right track records. So there are still risks associated with that, but I'd be broadly positive about those kinds of investors. Okay, if I can just turn to another end of the scale, and that is one of your below-threshold investments, which was in a construction company which is building houses in Shetland. Yeah. For key workers, presumably, to try and address the housing shortage there. One of the things that's mentioned in the report about that enterprise is that it's in the process, I think, of converting to, or may already now be, employee-owned. Yeah. Again, to the point about the ownership structure and what the company looks like and its governance and so on, is that something that you would view was that a positive additional reason why you would make that investment? So I'll take that one, thank you. So this is a fairly recent investment. I think from memory it's £730,000. Effectively, it's a loan to have 6 properties built in Lerwick, in an area where it's quite difficult to build affordable housing. Effectively, the loan was to a company that's been existing for a long time, who wants, through their own succession planning or family planning or whatever is the right word, transition the ownership to their employees. And I think that's laudable that they're planning to do that.
what will happen in due course is this loan will be repaid, these homes will go into other ownership, and the business itself that is building these will continue as a viable business, and hopefully they'll go on and build more properties. So it's a multifaceted angle. The reason that we went below our normal minimum on this one, which is $1 million, is because within the Act there's also additional elements about paying particular notice to more rural areas, highlands and islands, etc. And so it's unusual for us to go below our minimum threshold, but we felt it was right to do so in this area, and we would do so again in similar rural areas if we felt it was the right thing to do from an investment perspective. It has to be an investment and local impact perspective.
Yeah, okay. But is it fair for me to take from those answers that the employee ownership element didn't play much of a part in the decision to invest?
It was a positive.
It was a positive,
yeah.
And it meant that the investment would, the entity, the company, would continue to be a house builder in the local area and continue going forward rather than stop, lay people off, etc., as the owners retired. So I think that's actually a positive for long-term employment in the area and safeguarding of a business and part of an industry in the area.
Yeah.
So yes, it's a positive.
Yeah, I think more generally employee ownership is to be encouraged, because it comes back to this alignment point of aligning the workforce with the success of the organisation and its long-term nature. So I've long been a supporter of employee ownership.
Excellent. That's a very positive point here. I've got one other question. I see a couple of members want to come in with a quick final question. And my question goes back to the report and to the recommendation which, Mr Watt, I think you referred to at the very beginning.
Yeah.
And that is a recommendation which asks you to set out more clearly how you reach specific investment decisions and the factors that have influenced its choice of investment. And we've rehearsed some of that quite extensively during the course of this morning, not least in that last answer that you gave. But how do you plan to go about doing that? How do you plan to go about being a bit more transparent than you have been?
So the first thing to do is we accept a finding. It was someone else looking from the outside at what we're doing, and I think it was very helpful to have that opinion voiced. What we will do is we'll take that on board and we will move forward to do that. We do have, as part of our staff, people who are involved with our communication is the word, to all stakeholders. We clearly put information up on our website on every single one of our investments. We'll make sure it's more meaningful and add in the points that were made by the audit team. I think it was, I actually see it as a good piece of advice, and we will follow that piece of advice.
Short videos as well, I think we're going to put up that are quite accessible to people.
Yeah. Great. Okay. Graham Simpson, you've got a quick last question.
Yeah, thanks a lot. It was going back to something that you were discussing with Colin Beattie when you were talking about third-party capital and trying to attract third-party capital. I mean, do you see yourself becoming a fund manager that individuals and companies can invest in? I mean, I'm thinking there are a number of funds out there that invest in small companies in the UK. Would you see yourself being that kind of body investing in small companies in Scotland that anyone could invest in?
So I think our strategy to begin with, and our strategy is to align with like-minded institutional investors who want to make impactful investments in Scotland. And that's where we're finding what I call traction in meeting of the minds, because I think what we need to do is we have something that's quite unique. We are a meaningful investor, an impact investor in Scotland. We've got boots on the ground, we're well connected, we've got expertise, we're building a track record. And I think what I'm finding in my conversations with large institutional investors who have perhaps Scottish customers and Scottish presence is that they're interested in aligning with us on doing something similar with their asset pool, their money. So it would be institution to institutional rather than retail investors, which I think is the point that you'd be making. It would be absolutely institutional to institutional. So think of large pension fund, large insurance fund as being our clients rather than individual investors.
Okay, so it wouldn't be open to the public to...
There's no reason that they couldn't do that through. So an insurance company might have a pension or a fund that this could be a component part of, but they wouldn't get direct access to us certainly in the medium term.
The problems that Mr. Beattie outlined earlier on are much, much greater if you have private individuals investing than sort of experts like the ones I was talking to. But interestingly enough, the Green Bank of Connecticut, to go back to that, they have an annual open investment for all individuals in Connecticut can put money into an annual fund that then gets invested alongside the Development Bank's fund. So it can happen in particular criteria, but it's a whole different ballgame and it's much more complicated.
Yeah, it's a different set of regulatory hoops.
Yes, we're not the Public Audit Committee for Connecticut, fortunately. So I don't know. One very final brief question from the Deputy Convener, then we'll wrap it up. Jim.
Thank you. And it was actually a follow-on from the end of my last line of questioning. It's an area of interest. Is would the bank? I know you have your £1 million threshold, and you will go below it in the right circumstances. But even just from if nothing else, from a PR point of view, would you consider going or opening up seed funding opportunities at the sub £1 million investment level, if you could demonstrate, for example, that organisation, should it grow, would then be subject to further tiers of future investment as they grow, or indeed offer some sort of match funding opportunity? Because the big issue here is that the feedback that we often get is that, as you say, grant funding is limited and is becoming more scarce, and private banks are saying no to higher risk startup seed funders. So is there an opportunity for SNP to actually get involved at the lower end in the hope that these companies will scale up?
It's a good question. Scottish Enterprise has a role in that marketplace, and we don't want to duplicate anything that Scottish Enterprise would do. But it's possible that we could find organisations that operate in that seed space, that we would not be doling out the seed ourselves, but we could potentially find an organisation that could run a scheme on our behalf. And it might not just be in that space, it could potentially also be in decarbonisation, for example, where there are small organisations, farmers, individuals who don't have access to capital to put heat pumps in. It's possible that there are other areas where we could invest that would disseminate smaller amounts of capital into the marketplace. But we haven't found any yet.
Yeah, I mean, if you had £5 million and you gave 10 investments £500,000 each, over time, invariably some of them would do pretty well. And surely that's the whole point about growing the Scottish economy. You could actually play quite a vital role if you're willing to pay a little bit of attention at a small financial risk at that level.
I think Scottish Enterprise have this matched investment scheme that they would do with the angel networks, which is really very much aimed at that area. And, I think it works pretty well. And so the risk of that would be that we might be, if you like, competing with that, which might be a problem.
Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm reminded of the century-old question of the Macmillan gap and whether there is sufficient patient finance capital for the small and medium-sized enterprise sector. Well, that's a whole other discussion, which we don't have time for. But can I thank you very much indeed, Willie Watt and Al Denham, for your participation in the committee's work this morning. It's been a long session, but I think we found it very productive, very illuminating, and it's been very valuable to us. There were a couple of areas that we might want to follow up, but we shall be in contact with you to remind you of those and to seek any further information. But for the time being, can I thank you both very much indeed. And if we don't see you again, Mr Denham, wish you very well for your long and prosperous retirement. But you never know, we might see Mr Watt again before we finish up. But with that, could I close the public part of this morning's proceedings and move the committee into private session?